Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamu alaikum. I hope you all are fine and having a very good time. In the previous lecture, we started this concept or this study of post-colonial literature. But before jumping into post-colonial literature, I told you that we would be starting with actually what colonialism is. So we had a very good discussion of what colonialism is, how this colonialism or how this concept of colonial power came into existence or came into being, what was the motive behind this concept and incorporation of that concept. And then we had a slight discussion of how they captured all those territories. Then we had a discussion and differentiation between colonialism and imperialism as well. Today we are going to have a discussion of how this colonial power came to an end and how the process of decolonization started. Now, there are three major segments or stages of decolonization. Why decolonization started, we'll discuss it towards the end of this lecture, because this is how John MacLeod has discussed it in his book as well. As you know, the book is Beginning Post-Colonialism. So the first phase of decolonization or decolonialism is when some of the nations towards the end part of 20th century, they started those rebellious actions and they gained independence. So the first major portion that got independence and that the colony or the colonies got demolished was the region of America. Like we all know that the Americans got independence towards the later part of the 20th century. So this was the major first segment where this process of decolonization started. This process of demolishing the British Empire in that true sense which it previously was, got demolished, got devastated, and now Britain could not hold American region, so America got independence. That was the first major setback to the British Empire. Then towards very near part, means after 70s or towards 70s of the 20th century, the later part of that century, and then towards that first major part of 1900 to 1922, what happened that some other nations started to ask for independence, and they included like Canada, Australia, then New Zealand, and then later on South Africa and Ireland as well. But the difference between them and the first stage of decolonization was that in the first stage of decolonization, the American region, it got independence in its full form. But now in the second stage of decolonization, where, as I told you, Canada, South Africa, Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, they were set up as dominions where the natives or the native settlers or inhabitants were pushed aside, and the settlers from those European region, means the Britain part, they went there and they got settled, and then they held the government and the political and the socio-economic aspects and factors. So basically they got independence, but they were basically the dominions where they accepted Britain or England as their mother country. So this was the difference. Later on in 1931, this dominion setup was demolished as well. This was erased as well. And then those countries got the full independence, and they started having their full and sovereign government and independent government. So this was the later or the second stage of decolonization. Then Second World War came, and after the end of the Second World War, the third phase of decolonization started. Now in that phase, South Asia, where India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and so many other countries, even Hong Kong, and some parts of the South Africa, means the African region, and the West Indies, Trinidad and Tobago, they got complete independence. But remember this thing, that this complete independence came because of the rebellions, because of the revolts, and because of the internal spurs that took place in those territories. And like as a conclusion, Britain had to give them the independence. So this was the third phase of decolonization period. Now when we are discussing the decolonization period or the stages of decolonization, so basically the question that comes into the mind is why this process of decolonization? There could be a number of reasons, as there were a number of reasons for the colonialism or the colonization, there could be a number of reasons for decolonization. But one major reason for decolonization was that the nationalist movement started increasing in those territories where Britain had control. Like all those movements where nationalism was promoted, where people started asking for their rights, where people started asking for their identity, where people started asking for their own territorial identity, for their own cultural identity. So because of that, because they were very much exposed to the English culture, to the English language, to the English way of thinking. Now, people realized that their identity cannot be in the English culture, in the English language. Their identity is somewhere in their cultural roots, in their own native language. So the nationalist movement started, and because of those nationalist movements, the process of decolonization increased, and then gradually, or in the later part, all those nations or all those territories got independence, and they came up with their own identity, their own name, and their own sovereign governments. So that was the one major reason for decolonization. Another reason was that after the Second World War, this managing the process of managing those colonies for the British Empire was very much impossible. Why? Because after the Second World War, the economic situation of Britain was not the way it was in the previous times. So economically, it was not suitable for Britain or for the British Empire to manage all those territories, to all those colonies. So they wanted to give them a release, because it was a loss game. It was a game where they were losing, because administratively they had to spend a lot to manage all those countries. Although they were getting a lot in return from those territories, like in the form of resources, but administratively they had to control them. They had to push all those revolts and all those uprisings, and eventually they had to bribe so many people so that they could turn in their side. This was very much expensive for them. So they wanted to get rid of all those colonies, and because of those nationalist movement, that paved the way for this decolonization. So eventually what happened, decolonization completed, and all those territories where England or the British Empire had rule, they got full independence. This was today's lecture. I hope it is very clear. That have a very good time. Goodbye and Allah Hafiz.